Welcome back. Hopefully you all had a good break. Pass your homework to your left. Yeah. All right, so we're going to continue talking about the cardiovascular system, the heart. We went through the electrical activity, so now we're going to do kind of the mechanical activity. Is it too bright in here? No? All right. So as we all know, the heart is a pump, right? Basic anatomy, 2 atria, 2 ventricles, right and left. We talk about the heart, we're primarily talking about the left ventricle because that's what's going to be pumping blood to the systemic circulation, right, to all the organs of the body. And the way the system works is there are valves that prevent blood from going backwards. Blood is always going away from the heart and then in the veins back to the heart. So it's always flowing in this circuit. So when the ventricles are contracting, the AV valves, the valves between the atria and the ventricles, close to prevent blood from going back into the atria. So during this period, when both sets of valves are closed, the AV valves plus the valves that go into the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. This is called isovolumic or isovolumetric contraction because there's no change in volume, iso. When pressure inside the ventricle reaches the equal of the pressure inside the pulmonary arteries and the aorta, then those valves will begin to open. So when pressure builds up inside the heart enough so that it can push the blood that's already in the arteries out of the way, it forces those semilunar valves to open. So at this point, you've got ejection. And so the AV valves are still closed so blood doesn't go backwards, but the semilunar valves are open so that now blood goes into the arteries, which can then go out to all the organs. Diastole, when the heart begins to relax, these AV valves are still closed because there's still enough pressure in the ventricles to keep them closed. And the semilunar valves are closed also because once the heart starts to relax, the blood that had just pumped into the arteries tries to go backwards and forces the valves to close. So there's no change in volume here either because both sets of valves are closed. Nothing can go anywhere. So this is isovolumetric or isovolumic relaxation. And then eventually the ventricle is going to relax to the point where the pressure in the ventricle is less than the atria and the AV valves will open. And the ventricles begin to fill. Now, most of the filling that occurs is passive. It's basically blood goes into the ventricles because of gravity. Right? Blood that's coming back to the right atria just flows down into the right ventricle, or left side is the same. So that's going to account for about 2/3 of the blood that's in the ventricle. And then at some point, the atria are going to contract. And atrial contraction makes sure that the ventricles are full. So that gives you your other 1/3 of the total amount of blood in the ventricles. And then you're back to the beginning, where the ventricles start to contract and the atria are relaxing. We remember cardiac muscle is this striated muscle that acts a lot like skeletal muscle, only the cells are smaller, they have one nucleus, and they're connected together by gap junctions. Right, so any change in electrical activity, any depolarizing event in any one of those cells is going to be transmitted by these intercalated discs, which are made up of gap junctions, into the cell or cells that it's connected to. So our contraction is going to have a cross-bridge cycle with actin and myosin. Then our cells are going to be stimulated to contract because of these intercalated discs. So you're going to get a depolarizing wave traveling through all of these cells. We talked about the action potentials previously. Let's go through them again just to refresh everybody's memory. Right, two types of cells. You've got cardiac muscle, which has a resting membrane potential of around -90, right? Very low. But it doesn't matter how far away from threshold it is because it's an electrical synapse, so it automatically depolarizes to threshold. It's not like you can have an EPSP or an IPSP because there's no chemical synapse. It's an electrical transmission. So it's an immediate change in potential. There must be a range for this thing. So the action potential is roughly the same as other electrically excitable cells. It's about a positive 105 millivolts. That doesn't mean that it goes up to plus 105. That means it goes from -90 up to about plus 15. Right, so the total change is about 105. And we talked about the plateau phase. Phase 2 in cardiac muscle. And that's where calcium channels are open. They stay open for a longer period of time. So the heart has a long refractory period, a long absolute refractory period. So you can't get tetanus in heart muscle, which would be bad, because then you would probably die. And I assume that would be bad, but I've never tried it. Who knows? So if we compare the two, right, so we've got the nodal fibers, the SA and AV node fibers. They have these types of action potentials. So in those action potentials, in that electrical conduction system, you have the slow funny channels. So there's not a stable resting membrane potential. So you've got sodium and some calcium leakage into the cell. Eventually, it reaches threshold to open voltage-gated calcium channels. Remember, this is a calcium action potential, which is why it's rounded at the top, right? Sodium action potentials have a point because sodium channels are fast. They open fast. They close fast. Calcium channels are slower. So instead of getting a nice sharp point, you get this kind of rounded top. Then, of course, when the calcium channels close, potassium leaving the cell repolarizes it. In the muscle, cardiac muscle, you've got this immediate opening of fast sodium channels. because it's an electrical synapse. Right? The nodal fibers, the Purkinje fibers, form an electrical synapse with the muscle fibers, and then once an action potential occurs, it travels through all the muscle fibers because of gap junctions. And then, of course, so that's phase 0. Then up here, the sodium channels close, and you get this brief period where it starts to repolarize. Period 1. But because the calcium channels are opening, calcium is coming into the cell, giving you phase 2, and that's that plateau that extends the refractory period. And of course, once the calcium channels close, phase 3 repolarization occurs. And then you're back to phase 4 and start it all over again. So this will happen roughly 70 times a minute in your heart. Cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle begins at the beginning of the P wave and ends at the beginning of the next P wave. So one complete cardiac cycle includes all of the electrical and mechanical events that occur between two P waves. So we'll have periods of systole. We'll have atrial systole. When the atria are contracting, during that period, the ventricles are in diastole. They're relaxed. Then we'll have ventricular systole, where the ventricles are contracting and the atria are relaxed. The atria are in diastole. So in systole, you'll see an electronic or an electrical event, which is then followed shortly thereafter by the mechanical event of contraction. Of course, in diastole, the electrical signal is gone, so the cells are not being stimulated. And thus the channels are closed, and you have to reestablish those gradients for ions like sodium and potassium and calcium in order to be ready for the next event. One of the ways to control the strength of muscle contraction is to control the entry and exit of calcium from muscle cells. Remember, calcium is necessary for the cross-bridge cycle. The more calcium you have, the more cross bridges you can form, the stronger the contraction becomes. So altering influx and efflux of calcium is key in controlling the state of inotropy of these cells. Who remembers what inotropy means? Yeah, it's basically contractile strength, right? More calcium, positive inotropy. Less calcium, negative inotropy. EKG is where we measure, it's an indirect measure of the electrical events that are occurring in the heart at any given time. Right? P wave, QRS, T. So, speaking of that, the QT interval. What happens during the QT interval? Correlates most closely with what? What do you think? Let me see. BJ? Did I get it wrong again? Oh. Do me a favor. Go down in front and tell me when everybody's participating so I can continue.
Everybody's cards up. Don't forget that this is part of your participation grade. Easy as holding up a card. Make sure you're doing it.
Good? All right. Talk it over for a second with your neighbor. You're all over the place on this one. I see multiple colors. Either that or my medication's wearing off. What? No, during the PR interval, the atria contract.
So like right here, atria depolarization.
Right.
Like does it occur after the P wave has finished? During the P wave?
Well, when the P wave starts to depolarize, when you start depolarizing, you start contraction. So shortly after depolarization, contraction begins. All right, now what do we think? Ooh, still, well, most of you got it. QT interval correlates most closely with ventricular systole. Right? The QRS tells the ventricle to contract. It contracts. The atria cannot be contracting at the same time as the ventricle, so atrial systole is not going to occur during that. Atrial systole will be between probably what interval? Stephen? The PR. Yeah. So the PR interval correlates with atrial systole. The QT interval correlates with ventricular systole. Now here, I'm going to tell you right now, if you can draw this from memory, you're going to do just fine on the exam. This is called, this is a correlational diagram which correlates all of the events that occur during a cardiac cycle. All right, so remember the cardiac cycle begins from the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the next P wave. So here in the beginning, this PR segment is atrial systole, and then this QT segment, ventricular systole, also correlates with, shortly thereafter, there's going to be ejection of blood from the heart. So this is basically a time course of events that occur during the cardiac cycle. So it relates to sounds in the heart. First heart sound is closing of the AV valves. Second heart sound is closing of the semilunar valves. You have other heart sounds that could be caused by, they're usually called gallops, S3, S4. There are other types of gallops. It's basically blood flowing through these chambers, causing some kind of gurgling noise. So you've got your heart sounds. You've got your electrical events here on the electrocardiogram. You've got volume in the left ventricle. Remember, we talk about the heart, talk primarily about the left ventricle because that's for the systemic circulation. And then we've got the pressures, the pressure curve. So this is a different way of relating this. there's a little bit more information on the bottom, but if you can relate this part here, if you understand that, you're in pretty good shape. Now, this used to be called the Wiggers diagram, named after the English gentleman who put it all together. Sometime in the 90s, that word took on a different connotation, so we don't refer to it as that anymore, but if you read older textbooks, that's what it's referred to as. Come on. There we go. Ta-da. Let's start off with the heart sounds. Right? Sound one, if you remember from anatomy or undergraduate physiology, you've got lub-dub. Right? Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. First heart sound, closure of your tricuspid and bicuspid valves, the AV valves. So the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve. Second heart sound, that's your dub. Aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves are closing. You want a chair? No? All right. There might be an opening snap if you have a stenotic mitral valve. Right, so the valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. If it's stenotic, what does stenosis mean? Yeah, narrowing. So if you've got a narrowing of that, you can get what's called an opening snap. So not only can you hear the dub sound, but you can hear the snap as it opens. It's an abnormal sound. S3, third heart sound. It's a diastolic filling gallop. Not uncommon. Right? S3 is usually not much of a concern. A lot of people have S3s. S4, that's an atrial sound. It's an atrial gallop. That's a little more concerning. Flow, remember most of the flow through the atria into the ventricles is passive. If you've got a gallop, that might be a little disconcerting. Not necessarily serious, however. Stenosis. You're going to get a systolic extra sound. If the valve does not close completely, so in stenosis, it doesn't open completely. And you get reduced blood flow through the valve because of its narrowing. If you have valves that open just fine, but don't close completely, then you can get regurgitation. And you can hear that in the stethoscope. That'll give you a diastolic murmur. That's for the aortic or pulmonary semilunar valves. In the case of the AV valves, right, the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve, stenosis is going to give you a diastolic murmur, and regurgitation occurs during systole. So they're opposite. Let's talk about the ejection fraction. The ejection fraction is the percent of blood that is ejected from the left ventricle in one heartbeat. So when you're completely filled, you have 100% volume. After you contract, you have, let's say, 30% volume left, 30% of that left. So that gives you an ejection fraction of, come on, you guys did calculations, 70%. So we start off with 100%, your end diastolic volume. That's how much is in the left ventricle at the end of diastole, at the end of the relaxation or filling period. So that's going to represent the 100% number. That's the maximum amount of blood you have in that chamber, is your end diastolic volume. The end systolic volume is what is left over after systole. So after contraction, whatever blood is left in the left ventricle and did not leave to go into the aorta, that's your end systolic volume. And the determination of that difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume is basically going to be the force of contraction. How hard did that heart muscle contract to eject that blood? If it contracts more forcefully, you're going to get a higher ejection fraction. So you're going to have a lower end systolic volume at the end. You're going to eject more blood. If it contracts weakly, W-E-A-K. If it contracts weakly, you die, W-E-E-K. The same. So if it's a weak contraction, then the end systolic volume is going to be higher. You're going to have less blood left after the contraction in the ventricle. You're going to have a lower ejection fraction. Stroke volume is the difference between EDV and ESV. That's the volume ejected during one stroke or one heartbeat. So here we have a stroke volume of 70. So we take that number, put it over our 100%. 70 over 120 gives us a 58% ejection fraction, which is okay. 50 to 70, usually normal. Start going below 50, it's not good. We like to see 60% or better, but as you age, it could start to go lower. So at your age, you should be around 60%. If you're not, it's usually indicative of a problem. When you're old, as you get older, if you have an ejection fraction greater than 50, that's okay. So if you consider that you've got here a stroke volume of 70 milliliters, so one heartbeat pumps 70 milliliters of blood into the aorta. If you want to figure out how much blood you're pumping per minute, you multiply that by the number of heartbeats per minute, the number of times the heart contracts per minute. Heart rate is normally around 70. So if your heart rate is 70 and your ejection or your stroke volume is 70, what's the cardiac output? Yeah, 4.9 liters, 4,900 milliliters. Normal cardiac output is around 5 liters, 5,000 milliliters per minute. That's at rest. As you increase activity, cardiac output's going to increase. If you decrease activity, cardiac output could decrease slightly. It doesn't decrease a whole lot. So there's more on the upside than there is on the downside. You can increase your cardiac output up to about 20 liters per minute, so about 4 times normal, depending upon what your needs are. So an increase in end systolic volume with no change in end diastolic volume is going to cause what to happen? The most likely effect. What do you think? Hold them up. Yeah. Decrease in cardiac output. Right? So if EDV stays the same, 120 milliliters, and ESV increases, let's say 80 milliliters, then you've got a stroke volume of 50 instead of 70. Right? So your ejection fraction goes down, your cardiac output goes down. So let's look at what's going on in the aorta when the ventricle is going through its cycle, systole and diastole. Aortic pressure starts to increase during systole after the valve opens. Remember, you've got that period of isovolumic contraction where the ventricles are contracting in order to generate enough force to push those semilunar valves open. Right? Those arteries already have blood in them. You have to push that blood out of the way to open the valves. Once the valves are open, then you've got blood leaving the left ventricle, entering the aorta. Aortic pressure is going to start increasing as you pump more blood into it. So the aorta is going to want to stretch in order to accommodate that increase in blood flow. If you remember from anatomy, the wall of the aorta is very thick and muscular. When you contract muscle cells, their response, or when you stretch muscle cells, their response is to contract. So as the aorta gets filled, it's going to start to contract, so the pressure is going to increase, so the blood can get pushed farther along into those other vessels, those other arteries. When you get to the end of the ejection phase, so when the ventricle starts entering diastole, then the pressure in the aorta becomes greater than the pressure in the left ventricle, forces the aortic semilunar valve to close. The same thing in the pulmonary circuit on the right side. After the aortic valve closes, you get a nice little after peak, an incisura. We call that period between closure and the secondary peak, the dicrotic notch. Now, the rate of increase in pressure in the aorta was much greater than the rate in decrease in pressure in the aorta. Because as pressure starts to decrease in the aorta, the muscular wall doesn't contract as forcefully. Right? When you remove that stretch from the muscle, it starts to relax more. As far as the valves are concerned, as we said, they're there to prevent backflow. In order to prevent the valves from being pushed from the ventricles up into the atria, you have chorda tendineae. They're these rough fibers made primarily of collagen. They're attached to papillary muscles in the ventricle. So when contraction occurs, the papillary muscles contract as well, pulls on the chorda tendineae. That way, when the valves close, they don't get forced up into the atria. They stay in the ventricles. And just a little tidbit here. You think about the difference in the openings that you have, so going into the pulmonary artery or the aorta, and then going from the atria to the ventricle. All right, because it's a smaller opening, the velocity through those valves going into the arteries is going to be a little bit faster, because you've got a narrower opening to push the blood through. If you go into cardiology, that'll be interesting. We can talk about that velocity, and you can actually hear differences in velocity of flow through valves. So let's talk about the heart, the left ventricle, and what we're doing during a cardiac cycle. This is called a pressure volume loop. You can do a pressure volume loop for anything that fills up and empties. In the case of the left ventricle, this blue line should not be there, but it wouldn't let me get rid of it, so it's there. Ignore it. When you start off in the beginning of the cardiac cycle, you're in diastole. All right, you've just finished the last cardiac cycle, and now you're starting to fill with blood. So this is the period of passive filling. So while passive filling is occurring, you would expect an increase in volume. But not much of an increase in pressure, right? Because you're in diastole, you're relaxed. So you get that increase in volume, maybe a little bit of a change in pressure. Then when you're fully filled up, you're at 100%, you're at your end diastolic volume. At this point, the signal comes from the SA node, or from the AV node, excuse me, for the ventricles. So the signal's coming from the AV node to tell the left ventricle to contract, right? And that's where you begin your period of isovolumic contraction. You're contracting, but no blood is leaving because the aortic semilunar valve is still closed. You haven't generated enough force to push that open yet. Once you do, that begins the period of ejection. Now, pressure is still going to increase because the ventricle is contracting still. Blood is going to be forced into the aorta. Then once you begin diastole, then the pressure is going to start to drop in the ventricle, and then the aortic semilunar valve is going to close. That's going to represent your end systolic volume. And then you have isovolumic relaxation, so the heart's relaxing, but the valves are closed. So there's not going to be any change in volume, but pressure is going to decrease as the heart relaxes. If you put it all together like this point from your end diastolic volume here at B to your end systolic volume here at D is your stroke volume. That's how much was ejected from this left ventricle during one contraction. So you can see if your end systolic volume is higher, but the end diastolic volume hasn't changed, right? You had a weaker contraction and less blood was ejected. So your stroke volume is going to be less and your ejection fraction is going to be less. If your end diastolic volume increases, this will happen around 950 when you stand up. You'll get a surge from muscle contraction. You'll get a surge of blood being pushed into the heart. Right, and then within a half a second, the effects of gravity will start to push blood back down. So you'll get kind of this two-phase response. So when the end diastolic volume increases, the heart has to contract more forcefully in order to get back to a normal ESV. Right? So that means stroke volume would be greater if ESV did not change but EDV got higher. That leads us to the Frank-Starling mechanism, which is basically a mechanism that tells you that if you put more blood into the heart, it will contract more forcefully, which we already know because we said when you stretch muscle, it contracts more forcefully in response to that stretch. So within physiologic limits, so under normal conditions, all the blood that enters the heart gets pumped out. When I was in the Navy, I was on a submarine, we used to say that if the number of times you dive does not equal the number of times you surface, there's a problem. It's the same thing with the heart. If the amount of blood that goes in does not equal what is coming out, there's a problem. If the heart is too weak and can't pump the blood that's coming into it, it will start to distend. Right? Blood will accumulate in the heart. That will increase the pressure in the heart, which will decrease venous return because you've got that increase in resistance. So you'll start to get things like pulmonary edema, blood that can't leave the pulmonary circuit because the pressure in the heart is too high. It's not pumping all the blood. Usually there's not much of a problem that you're pumping too much, because if you pump too much, it's just going to come in on the back end. The big problem is not pumping enough. According to Frank-Starling, the heart just completely devoid of any other input at all. No sympathetic or parasympathetic input on its own. When those cardiac myocytes are stretched, when you increase end diastolic volume, you increase venous return, that heart is going to contract more forcefully. That's going to set up a positive inotropic state. So in a nutshell, Frank-Starling basically says that as your end diastolic volume increases because of an increase in venous return, you have to increase contractility in order to keep that rule in place. Whatever comes in has to go out. Right? They have to be equal. So an increase in venous return is going to stimulate cardiac muscle stretch and an increase in contractile strength. Questions on that? Got it? So as you begin exercising, skeletal muscle activity increases. It squishes the veins in the muscle, forces blood back towards the heart. So that increases blood flow to the right atrium through the inferior vena cava. What's that going to stimulate? It's going to be the result of that increase in venous return. Well, that was too easy. Yeah, I just said it, right? Increased contractile strength. So let's talk about autonomic effects on the heart. We're not done with the autonomic nervous system yet. We're going to keep going through it throughout physiology. Increased stimulation, as you know, increases heart rate by its effect on the SA and AV nodes. It's also going to increase contractility. Epinephrine, positive inotropic, positive chronotropic. You can get a heart rate up to about 200 beats per minute. Once you start going over that number, the period of diastole is usually not long enough to completely fill. So that starts to interfere with cardiac output. But you can get a heart rate up to 200, which is why if you exercise, they say to take 200 minus your age, or is it 220? I don't know, I haven't exercised in a while. I did this morning, but I never checked my heart rate. Mystery. I like mystery. Parasympathetic stimulation. Decrease in heart rate does not really significantly alter contractility. M2 receptors are primarily found on the nodal cells, not necessarily on the contractile cells, so there's not much of a change in contractility from parasympathetic stimulation, but there's definitely going to be a decrease in heart rate. Of course, we said too high of a heart rate tachycardia is bad, doesn't give your heart enough time to fill with blood, doesn't have a long enough diastolic period. And of course, too low a heart rate bradycardia would be bad as well. You're not pumping enough blood to supply the tissues. So if we look at the effect of sympathetic stimulation, so here, normal sympathetic stimulation, right? You increase your cardiac output from normal up to about double, a little bit more than double. With maximum sympathetic stimulation, you can get as high as 22, 23, 24 liters per minute as a cardiac output. That's a lot of blood to pump. That doesn't usually last for a long period of time. Zero sympathetic stimulation, also assuming zero parasympathetic stimulation, your heart rate will ensure a cardiac output of about 7 liters. Normally you have vagal tone. Normally you have parasympathetic stimulation, keeping the heart rate lower than the spontaneous depolarization rate of the SA node. So it keeps your cardiac output at rest about 5 liters per minute. So the factors you can affect are going to be contractility, right, with the sympathetic system, or with an increase in end diastolic volume. When more blood is coming back to the heart, when you have more venous return and the end diastolic volume goes up, we refer to that as a preload. You're preloading the heart. So that's going to cause it to contract more forcefully. That'll increase your stroke volume, your cardiac output. On the other end of the spectrum, if you've got arterial disease, if you've got stenosis, if you've got plaques building up in the arteries, then you're going to have an increase in arterial pressure. That increase in arterial pressure is going to resist blood flow out of the heart. The pressure going into the aorta is going to be higher, so you're going to need to generate more force to pump blood into it. That's referred to as an afterload. So preload deals with what's coming into the heart before it contracts. Afterload deals with what's preventing blood from leaving the heart, right, during its contraction. Which brings us here, back to our pressure volume curve. Increased contractility, as we said, here in this red line, positive inotropic effect causing an increase in stroke volume ejection fraction. Increased preload. We talked about increasing EDV, right? ESV remains constant, so the heart, Frank Starling, will contract more forcefully to eject that blood. So you're going to get a higher ejection fraction or a higher stroke volume. Afterload. Afterload is going to prevent blood from leaving the left ventricle when it contracts, because you're going to have a higher pressure in the aorta, in the systemic circuit. So in that case, the same contraction is going to result in a higher end systolic volume. You have to go against more pressure, so you're going to have a lower stroke volume. You can't pump as much blood during that cycle. Any questions? Have a good weekend. See you on Monday.